Hello, I'm here at SuperReturn Emerging Markets 2015 with Rory Ord, a principal at RisCura. A recurring theme at this conference has been Africa and the opportunity it presents. Rory has published a series of reports called Bright Africa, which look at investment in the African continent, including private equity. The latest report has just been published, which looks at the drivers, enablers and managers of investment across the African continent. Rory, over recent years we've seen significant capital raised by private equity targeted at Africa. Is this putting pressure on multiples?
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, there has been significant capital raised in recent years. We've had about $4 billion in each of the last few years for Africa, which is a significant uptick on previous years of fundraising. What this has meant is that particularly at the top end of the market, we've seen more pressure on pricing. This has particularly been from or a result of the entrance of the large international private equity firms who have largely targeted the upper end of the market. What we have found, and what comes through in the report, is that in the rest of the private equity markets, at the lower levels, the smaller deals are not seeing the same pricing pressure as we're seeing at the top end.
Okay, that's very interesting. Another topic that's come up in relation to Africa is infrastructure. What are your observations around this asset class? How do we go from talking to building?
Well, I think what we all know about infrastructure in Africa is that there's not enough of it. When we look at energy, we look at road and rail penetration, we find that there's significant deficits across the whole continent. Even in the more developed parts of the continent, there are areas for improvement. But all of that improvement takes a lot of capital. And what we are seeing is that governments across the continent in various African countries don't have the capital at their disposal. They don't have the tax revenue and other sources of capital to actually fill those gaps, which leaves a significant gap for the private sector to actually fill. Hence the role of PPPs on the continent.
And so these are public-private partnerships?
These are public-private partnerships, exactly. So we're seeing those start to happen mainly in the areas that can be more easily monetized. So in the areas of, for example, energy production in South Africa particularly, and then in things like toll roads as well in various places around the continent.
So we're beginning to move towards building?
We're starting,
but there's a long way to go and lots to do. Lastly, it's often overlooked that there are institutional investors within Africa investing in Africa. Does your report have any observations on such an asset pool?
Absolutely. I think this is something that's not well understood internationally, is the role of local African institutions such as pension funds and insurance companies and the large pool of capital they actually have at their disposal. By our count, there's more than $600 billion of local capital in Africa, which far outweighs most sources of capital on the continent. And what we find is that most of that capital is being directed locally. For regulatory reasons and others, African institutions are finding investment opportunities in their own listed markets, in equity, in private equity, and of course in local bond markets and property, with only small allocations to outside investments.
Are such local assets concentrated in any particular regions?
They are. Most of the assets in the institutional landscape in Africa originate from South Africa, as historically the most developed of the different markets. But what we're increasingly finding is that those South African assets are being deployed around the rest of the continent, both in private equity, and a lot of that has been discussed here today, but also in listed equity and some into listed bonds and corporate bonds around the continent. Okay,
no, thank you, Rory, for giving us your insight into the drivers, enablers and managers of investment across the African continent. The full report can be downloaded from riscura.com/brightafrica.